Welcome to this presentation, which is made for the Alternative Medicine College of Canada. This is a 60-minute presentation in which we'll discuss a little more of an introduction to the energetics of medicinal herbs. In the next hour or so, here's our agenda. We'll talk about how illness is perceived differently from different viewpoints. Then we'll move on to the energetics of herbs, which we also call phytoenergetics, and this is discussed in more detail in the course module F353. So this presentation is extra material from this module. So we'll talk about how the energetics of herbs is really where two types of thinking meet. And then why are phytoenergetics necessary in the naturopathic practice? We'll touch a little bit more on TCM theory and plant classification in TCM, and we'll finish with a few practical examples from the naturopathic practice in order to illustrate the concepts described in this presentation. In our conventional medical thinking, illness is seen as something very linear and mechanical. In fact, in this way of thinking, the body is a mechanical system that follows its own very logical rules. The rules follow a sort of linear system where relationships themselves are linear. It then entails that if we understand how different parts work according to their own linear logical rules, if a part is malfunctioning, which is what illness is perceived to be, then that part needs to be repaired or replaced. It's as simple as that. Generally speaking, in our modern conventional medical system, germs and other external influences like viruses, fungus, heavy metals, toxins can be the cause of illness, but we do not acknowledge emotions, the spirit, intellect as being possible causes of illness. Causes of illness so far have only been recognized as being physical. So this is the definition that most medical conventional doctors would use when it comes to illness. This is quite different from the way illness is perceived from a holistic standpoint. In holistic medicine, which is what many traditional systems of medicine are based on, like Ayurveda, traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM, ancient Greek or Galenic medicine, traditional European botanical medicine. These are all holistic types of medicine, and they perceive illness very differently. For them, the body has its own intelligence, and it's not only made up of a linear relationship, but is actually made up of multiple interconnected networks, where one network might be connected to several different networks. So it's a very complex world. We can therefore influence one network, and it might then influence another network located further down. And that network will then influence another part of another network. So it's a little bit like the butterfly effect, where a butterfly flaps its wings somewhere in the world and it triggers a storm at the other end of the planet. So the complex system makes illness itself a much more multifactorial issue. In the holistic view, psychological, spiritual, and physical factors can influence interactions between multiple networks. So emotions can influence a network, which will in turn influence another network, which will in turn influence a physical part of the body like an organ. In this view, illness is a state of disequilibrium, and for health to resume, balance must be restored. So that state of disequilibrium must be fixed so that equilibrium is found again. When we look at modern thinking, which we could describe as materialistic, reductionistic, we can see that it's very different from naturopathic holistic thinking. So in the reductionistic world, we only look at parts And basically, if we zoom in on each part and fully understand each part and how it interacts with another part, then we can understand the whole. In holistic thinking, we look at the whole, so it's a bit of a wider angle perspective. The reductionist way of thinking is also generally very logical and rational, whereas there is a bigger space for intuitive thinking in the holistic model. In the naturopathic practice, we certainly need to use both our logical brain and our intuitive side. So when a patient comes in, our intuition may dictate us to ask a specific question, or a bit of a sixth sense will make us wonder about a certain part of a patient's life and inquire more about that. But we certainly still need to have our logical hat on to understand the physiology, side effects of drugs, components of their treatment. The reductionist thinking also puts a lot of emphasis on the analytical mind, whereas in holistic thinking, we're much more synthetic. So in holistic thinking, we put much more emphasis on the interaction between different networks and parts. Whereas in reductionist thinking, again, we zoom in and we dive in to really understand how a part or different parts interact together. In reductionist thinking, we're much more static. This comes from the fact that science did not allow us to really have much of a dynamic way of thinking. We used to study physiology by dissecting dead bodies. And so that was a very static view of physiology. We could only visualize things under a microscope if they had been cut up and fixated with various different chemicals. So under the microscope, we could not see moving parts. And that's how our thinking about physiology and the human body has generally been very static. Whereas, of course, the human body is a dynamic entity with lots of functions happening at the same time, and so it requires more of a dynamic thinking in order to really understand it. In our modern day way of thinking, we try to be as objective as possible. Whereas in holistic thinking, subjective thinking is allowed. So in subjective thinking, we are a filter of what reality is at this point, and that's okay. So in objective thinking, we try to, as an observer, remove ourselves entirely from what we're observing. Whereas in holistic thinking, we realize that the observer is part of that environment and cannot be entirely removed. And in fact, the way the observer impacts the environment may be very beneficial. So in the naturopathic practice, we ourselves, as practitioners, are an element of the therapeutic relationship of the patient's immediate environment. And we can be a source of positive healing, of positive regeneration. The therapeutic relationship can really allow us to leverage the healing abilities of the body by creating a safe environment where the patient feels listened to, where they can relax, where they can start pondering about things that may help them get better. So in the naturopathic practice, we're very much in a more subjective place than our usual reductionist thinking would allow in a more conventional medical practice. In the reductionist way of perceiving the world, everything is sequential, very linear, very clean and easy. And it really ignores the fact that many things actually work in networks, and that if we influence a part of a network, a part of several other networks may be affected. Sometimes in the world of complementary and alternative medicine, we will tend to view reductionist thinking very negatively, and we will put a lot of positive emphasis on holistic thinking. This is actually a mistake. We have to think of it as a pendulum, where in the last 500 years, we have very much seen the pendulum swing towards reductionist thinking. In fact, since Descartes, and then later on, since the advent of the Industrial Revolution, we have made leaps and bounds in terms of technological and scientific research, which has really put reductionist thinking on a pedestal. But it is true that reductionist thinking has allowed these advances that had been up until this point not possible, because we were possibly stuck in an overly holistic way of thinking. So the pendulum, maybe at the time when traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurveda was developed, was much more swinging towards the rights and holism, but perhaps a little too much. So we were able to perceive things from a subjective distance standpoint, but with Descartes and the Industrial Revolution, we're able to zoom in on the parts and to really understand logic and linear relationships. And now gradually we have come to the limits of reductionist thinking taken to the extreme, and the pendulum needs to gradually swing back to the right and hopefully stop somewhere in the middle. Whereas we used to think holistically, we now have a great deal of knowledge that has been gathered through reductionist thinking, which we can now use as we step back into holistic thinking. So, for example, there was a lot that was known about plants through their phytoenergetic traits. But now we know a lot more about plants because we know about their compounds and we understand more about the way they interact with physiology. So now we can add that to our phytoenergetic knowledge of the plant. And that's useful because now we understand better how a plant may negatively interact with medication, for instance. So it's almost like a spiral where we went from holistic to reductionist, and now we're back into holistic plus plus, augmented with the knowledge from our reductionist thinking. The problem too with being stuck in holistic thinking, which complementary and alternative medicine encourage us to do as therapeutic practitioners, is that it then becomes very difficult to communicate with conventional medical practitioners. And that is not useful for the profession because, for the good of our patient, we also need to understand that terminology. We need to be able to communicate using their vocabulary so that we're taken seriously, so that they want to communicate with us, and so that we can best serve our patient by trying to integrate both worlds and convert a lot of the information from the reductionistic world into something that can be used in the holistic practice. A more visual way, perhaps, of understanding the difference between reductionism and holism is this cartoon. So this is the classical example of blind people trying to understand what an elephant is when they've never seen one. So the person who touches the tusk of the elephant thinks that it's a spear. The person who touches the ear thinks it's a carpet. The person who touches the nose of the elephant thinks it's a snake. The person who touches the tail thinks it's a rope. So every person who zooms in on a part ends up understanding the part fully, but never develops an awareness of how the parts really fit together to create a whole that is indeed very different from the sum of its parts. Critics of modern medicine would argue that this is where medicine has taken us now. Extreme reductionist thinking means that we visit different specialists who each only look at one little part of the body. The urologist for the bladder, the ophthalmologist for the eyes, the gastroenterologist for the digestive system. And we need that reductionist knowledge of a part. We don't need to discard that entirely, of course, but what we need is to be able to zoom out and see how these different parts interact within the intelligence of the human body to create something that is much more complex and greater than the whole. Another way of looking at it is by realizing that reductionist thinking means if we understand the parts very well and we put the parts together, then the parts sum together equal the whole, which is what we see here at the top. However, with the human body, we can't really reduce it to its parts and still retain the meaning of the whole. So when we put it apart, we understand every little piece very well, but that's different from the entirety of the human organism. And due to the complexity of the human physiology, we can't only apply reductionist thinking. And there's still a lot that we need to understand, but we're gradually understanding that holistic thinking has its values as well. And like I said earlier, the pendulum is generally swinging back towards more holism. So in that way, trying to achieve a balanced way of thinking that is neither too extremely reductionistic or nor extremely holistic would be something like this, that bacterial germs and other germs will generally reproduce better in a certain environment, and that environment is a combination of physical factors and energetics, for example, our spiritual world, our emotions. And physical factors would be our nutrition, building blocks in our body, taking such or such supplement. And in order to bring balance back, we must both eliminate the bacterial germ and correct the environment. So, for example, a stomach ulcer can be caused by Helicobacter pylori, a bacteria that likes to live in the stomach mucosa. Conventional medicine will only try to remove the germ in order to fix the ulcer. It will give you antibiotics, which are often very successful at removing Helicobacter. However, if nothing is done to change the terrain, in other words, the properties of the mucosa, which make it attractive for the Helicobacter, the bacteria is likely to return and the problem will become recurrent. So the idea is not to just try to correct the terrain, but to also eliminate the bacteria, because there is value in the fact that bacteria do indeed contribute to illness. And it is wrong to think that there is no external influence in illness. There can indeed be a factor that comes from an external influence. We mustn't throw that away completely, but correcting the terrain remains, of course, very important, which is an aspect that conventional medicine is finally starting to acknowledge again. In traditional Chinese medicine, they were coming from a very holistic way of thinking, but perhaps their pendulum was swung too far to the right or to the holistic side, and they realized that in order to understand that whole better, they still needed to break it down into different classifications in order to understand it better. So that is how the 8 principles of TCM came about. For TCM, illness is imbalance, but it's not enough to say that, and they recognized that back then already. So they tried to characterize it more by reducing it into an imbalance of qi, yang, or fluids, or yin. And the imbalance can be better understood if we break it down further into an imbalance of interior or exterior. So does the illness lie in the exterior of the body, which means basically in our skin and sweat glands? Does that illness need to be sweated out to then exit our body? Or is it a deeper interior imbalance that cannot simply be fixed by perspiring more or released to the exterior, as they will say in TCM? Is the illness due to an excess or a deficiency of fluids, of qi, of yin? Is the illness mostly hot or cold? And is it an excess or a deficiency of yin or yang? So in traditional Chinese medicine, after they had broken down the imbalance into proper little categories, we could then come up with a TCM diagnosis based on these 8 principles. It then follows that once you have a TCM, more or less holistic diagnosis, you need to figure out how you're going to treat this. So if the illness is a state of imbalance, how do you bring balance back? Well, they would use acupuncture and they would use medicinal plants or a combination of plants. And the plants can help rectify this imbalance. But how do you know which plant to use? For that, you need to find a plant whose energetics match the holistic or energetic diagnosis of the patient. To understand this better, let's look at a little example that hopefully bridges the more modern or Western way of thinking with the older TCM way of thinking. Imagine that a 40-year-old patient comes to your practice presenting with the following symptoms. They feel very tired when they wake up. It takes them a long time to get going. When they finally get going, they have a very sleepy moment in the early afternoon, possibly after lunch. In the last 3 years, they've been really stressed out at work. But they've noticed that in the last year, they've had very frequent upper respiratory tract infections and several bouts of sinusitis, which required lots of antibiotics. This is a very classical case from the practice. Unfortunately, in our modern day world, people are very stressed out, they have a lot of deadlines, and so their adrenal glands have to work overtime to produce adrenaline and cortisol. Adrenaline and cortisol will help us meet our stress demands, but at some point, our adrenals have reached their limits. And that is what we colloquially will call adrenal fatigue, or an HPA axis maladaption. So it's not well adapted to the environment anymore. And when that happens, gradually due to the deficiency or peaks in cortisol, our immunity starts to occur. And when low immunity occurs, it can occur in various areas, but of course the respiratory area is a big one for many people. So now we know that there's mostly adrenal fatigue and a bit of a respiratory sensitivity. Which plants are we going to choose? Well, TCM would say the adrenal glands are part of the kidney. So the TCM kidney encompasses the kidney and the adrenals. So TCM would say the adrenal glands are part of the kidney. There is a bit of a kidney yang deficiency with that adrenal fatigue. We need kidney tonics, which are also called adaptogens. Adaptogens will help regulate the adrenal glands so that if they're producing excess cortisol, it can be reduced. If they're producing too little cortisol, it can be improved, and generally bring things back to balance and increase our resilience to physical and emotional stress. The problem is we have quite a number of adaptogens. We have probably hundreds of them. Here are 4 of the more common and well-known ones: rhodiola, schizandra, Eleutherococcus, also called Siberian ginseng, Panax quinquefolius, also called American ginseng, and Panax ginseng, also called Asian ginseng. If we try to have a reductionistic approach to these adaptogens, we study their compounds. They are made of thousands of compounds, and we realize that all adaptogens have compounds like this. They look very complicated, but actually we see that the top ones really look like our adrenaline and noradrenaline, or our catecholamines. So a lot of our adaptogenic plants can mimic adrenaline or noradrenaline in the cellular receptor and therefore modulate what our adrenal glands are doing in terms of these catecholamines. But other adaptogens contain other types of molecules that have a different shape that look more like corticosteroids, cortisol in essence, and certain cortisol precursors. So that's great. Now we understand better why these herbs have been called adaptogenic over the centuries. We never really quite knew why, but science tends to prove a lot of the things that traditional medicinal bodies had already identified. And it's great to understand this better, right? Because now, from a reductionistic standpoint, we would say adaptogenic plants can be classified in 3 categories: those containing catecholamine-like molecules, others containing corticosteroid-like molecules, and others which have molecules that we don't quite understand yet, which we would call other molecules. For this 3rd category, that is where our traditional phytoenergetic understanding of the plant is very useful, because back then they may not have known what the molecular makeup is, but they would have maybe already known, hey, this plant is great for kidney and respiration, and that would then help us pick the right plant. So we see here that purely a phytoenergetic knowledge of the plant is enough for us to prescribe the adequate plant for this patient. Here in this case, we probably wouldn't pick rhodiola or schizandra because they have more of an effect on concentration, brain health. Schizandra is useful for skin and hair and nails and vision. We probably wouldn't use Panax ginseng or Asian ginseng because that has very stimulating properties. So it's not very useful for a person who already has a bit of a deficiency condition, and it can in fact aggravate symptoms. So now we're left with American or Siberian ginseng. Siberian ginseng, or Eleutherococcus, grows in Siberia, and so it's been very well studied by the Russians in the 60s and 70s. And we know that Siberian ginseng is great for building resilience to physical stressors. So that could be a good choice of plant for this patient. But I also really like American ginseng for him because American ginseng is not only an adrenal gland tonic, but it's actually great for respiratory afflictions. So for a low immunity in the respiratory system due to adrenal fatigue. So for him, purely based on phytoenergetics, I would use American ginseng. But it's nice to know on top of that, all that knowledge about the molecules and compounds found in plants and how they work. That's how we've understood, for example, that licorice or glycyrrhiza, which is also an adrenal tonic, can create hypertension in certain people. It has a compound which directly works on those receptors for different hormones, and it creates high blood pressure. So we know now that licorice cannot be used in a person with hypertension. So we see how the reductionistic way of thinking is still very useful, but it can really nicely complement the phytoenergetic knowledge about a plant. As I said earlier, in TCM they had a very holistic way of thinking, but they also understood that they needed a little more, that it was almost too holistic. And so they tried to break down diagnosis into the 8 principles. They looked at qi, yang, fluids, yin. And they generally would use terminology from what they could observe and understand of the physical and macroscopic environment around them. They didn't have microscopes, they didn't know anything about molecules. All they really knew was what was around them, seasons, and other elements of nature. So the terminology that they used to classify diagnoses and then plants was based on that vocabulary, seasons and elements of nature. And that is why we have also a system of thought from TCM called the 5-element theory. The elements are really just words to describe classifications, categories. So we shouldn't get too hung up on the word of the element itself, but rather on the associations that traditional medicine practitioners had already seen back then. So for example, in the element fire, we will put the heart and the small intestine. The element of fire is associated with joy, love, and laughing. So you could see how if a person is really excited, that's not too bad, but if they're too excited, too stressed out, it can start creating palpitations, panic attacks, chest oppression. So suddenly we have a lot of heart symptoms. The small intestine, again, we know that there is a whole neurological system in the gut that is connected to the brain, that brain neurotransmitters like serotonin are very active down the whole length of the small intestine. And so you see in TCM they had already observed a lot of these things. They've associated heat and the tongue with that element as well, and generally the ability of the blood to circulate, which comes from the triple warmer or triple energizer as well. When fire is healthy, it will produce earth, which is the yellow here, the next element. The element of earth, again, don't get too hung up on the word, is associated with late summer or generally the last 2 weeks of any season. It's a phase of transformation and transition from a season to another. The spleen and the stomach in the body, and the pancreas is associated with that as well, are directly responsible for that transformative power of taking food and turning it into nutrients and other bits that need to be eliminated. The stomach and spleen in the element earth are associated with empathy and sympathy, and the spleen is particularly affected by worry. And you may have noticed this, that when a person worries too much, they start developing heartburn, burping, feeling bloated. So again, something that TCM had already identified a while back. The spleen is also responsible in partly with regulating muscles and is associated with the taste sweet. So eating too many sweets can be associated with a spleen condition in TCM. And again, that makes a lot of sense now that we see it from a more reductionistic, more different perspective. When we eat a lot of carbs, a lot of sweet foods, that starts feeding a lot of bacteria in the small intestine. It creates a condition of SIBO. The bacteria in the small intestine, fed by the sweets, start creating a lot of gases like methane, hydrogen sulfide. These things stay stuck in the small intestine, and now we feel bloated, something very much associated with spleen dampness due to overeating sweets. So although back then their terminology was a little cruder, the observations that they made were very much on the spot. And so now we have the benefit and the privilege of being able to use this information plus extra knowledge that comes from the modern day world. When the earth is doing well, so when we're digesting well, our stomach and spleen are digesting things well, then we move into metal. The color white is associated with it, and it's associated with the large intestine and the lung. You may wonder what the lung and large intestine have to do with one another, but actually they are both organs of elimination. The lung helps us eliminate carbon dioxide, help us reduce acidosis in the body, and the large intestine, of course, eliminates plant material that we cannot digest and eliminate a great deal of bacteria, as well as other compounds. The lungs and large intestine and the element metal in general are very much associated with grief, guilt, and regret, sadness in general. And they're associated with crying and sighing deeply. The lung and large intestines, and the lungs in particular, really control the nose, the skin, the hair, and that is why a lot of exterior conditions will improve when given herbs that stimulate that metal element. When the metal element, which is associated with the season of the fall, is doing well, it then produces the element of water. Again, don't get hung up on the words. Water is just the name they gave for that classification which encompasses the kidney and bladder. Kidney was also associated with bone health, with hearing and ears in general. And severe fear or a lot of anxiety will start affecting the kidney. So a lot of people who have anxiety will end up having adrenal fatigue, which is again our kidneys. Anxiety in the long run is over-triggering our fight or flight reaction or our sympathetic nervous system, which is again very difficult and exhausting on the adrenal glands. And so it will lead to a kidney deficiency or an adrenal gland deficiency. A lot of people with adrenal deficiency need to urinate frequently at night. Again, more about the association between anxiety, bladder, and kidney there. When the water element is doing well, it then creates the wood element, which is associated with the color green, and that's the liver and gallbladder. Our bile is indeed very green, and when our liver is overwhelmed, like during a hungover and we feel nauseous, we start having a little greenish complexion. In the same way that a person who is unable to breathe properly, like in asthma or COPD, will develop a very pale and whitish complexion. The liver and gallbladder are associated with anger, resentment. They have to do with shouting. The liver opens in the eyes. It controls the tendons, the connective tissue, the fascia, ligaments. And that is associated with spring. And when that does well, wood creates fire. So in acupuncture, for example, if a person has a deficiency in the earth element, we would tonify the fire. Or if there's an excess when it comes to earth, we would try to tonify metal. There is also in the middle the star that you see here, which is the controlling cycle. So water controls fire, fire controls metal, metal controls wood, and wood controls earth. So if, for example, we had a wood excess, you might tonify metal to start controlling wood more. So these are associations that we can use in our treatment plan, especially in acupuncture. Sometimes the word can become confusing. Why should the lungs be metal? Why should the liver be wood? But again, it's more that they were trying to connect networks together, and they gave them names from what they observed outside of them, which is all they knew really at the time. In order to illustrate this better, we'll move on to a few cases from the naturopathic practice. These are cases that we see very often, patterns of diagnosis and illness that are very, very common. Our first example will have to do with plants that are tonifying to the yin of the lungs. Our second example will be for plants that are tonifying to the yang of the stomach. And our last example will be about spleen-yang tonics. So again, these terms describe the phytoenergetic properties of the plants, and it's very complementary knowledge to what we might know through reductionist thinking. Moving on to our first example. A person comes to your office. They've had a cold now for a while. they feel like their throat is very dry and raspy, their voice a little hoarse. They have a cough which is very dry, maybe a little spasmodic, like an asthma type of cough. They bring up very little mucus. The mucus is scanty, it's white, it's sticky. From this, we are able to diagnose that the person has a lung yin deficiency. Remember that yin is what moisturizes the mucous membranes. It's fluids. So when we have a fluid deficiency, the membranes become very dry, the mucus not very moisturized, and for this reason it becomes sticky and scanty. When the mucus is yellow, it's generally more associated with a heat condition. When it's white, we think more of a deficiency of yin. Some lung yin tonics that are very common are plantago, which is plantain, inula, also called elecampane, althea, which is marshmallow, and verbascum, which is mullein. All of these plants, because they tonify the lung, tend to be classified as metal plants. So it's not that they contain any metal, it's just that they help the lung. So we put it in the metal classification. This is a bit of an arbitrary classification because, as you know, plants are made up of thousands of compounds and they can have very prominent actions on multiple systems of the bodies, which is why the same plant may be used in Western botanical medicine, in TCM, and in Ayurveda, but actually more known in each system of medicine for their effect on one or another system. So for instance, all of these plants are considered yin tonics because they all contain mucilage, basically compounds that are very good at absorbing water and at retaining that water to moisturize the mucus, creating a bit of a band-aid effect on the mucous membrane, moisturizing them, protecting them, and allowing them to heal better. The mucilage makes them great emollients, softening, reducing dryness. The mucilage and emollient effect is pronounced in the respiratory sphere, but it can also be very pronounced in the digestive sphere. So plantain and marshmallow we use a lot when there's irritated mucous membrane in the digestive system. For example, in the case of gastritis or gastroesophageal reflux, creating heartburn. So in TCM, they have been put in there or recognized for their respiratory yin tonic quality and put in the metal category, but they could have probably also partially have been put in the earth or digestive category. Just to have a look at these little plants, we see here on the top left is our plantain, our mullein on the top right, marshmallow, that delicate purple plant in the bottom right, and inula or elecampane, whose flower really looks like a very nice yellow sun in the bottom left. It's always good to remember what these plants look like so that our knowledge is not so separate from the actual concrete plants. Moving on to our second example. Now we have a patient who comes in with borborygmus, which is basically sounds coming from the abdomen, from gas traveling down the length of the digestive system. The patient tells you that even with lighter meals, they feel a sense of indigestion, a heaviness in the solar plexus. Feels like food sits there for a long time. The taste comes back up for a long time. Putting a hot water bottle on their tummy seems to help, but their stools are nevertheless very pasty. They have an overall feeling of heaviness, sluggishness, they feel lethargic, and they feel bloated. Their abdomen is bloated, they can have water retention in their legs. Their face even can sometimes look a little puffy, especially if they had difficulty digesting a food the day before. This would be a typical example of a stomach yang deficiency. Here, the stomach needs a little help in not creating as much gas, so we'll use a lot of tonics which are hot in nature, like caraway, fennel, anise, and melissa, which are used in a lot of culinary tradition after a meal to help digest better. So this is something that had been observed for a long time. Digestive yang tonics are in the earth category because they boost the digestive system, and very often they have a heaty or hot nature, like ginger, for example. They're a bit spicy somehow, and that is because they're aromatic plants. And the aromatic compound of these plants, meaning these are plants from which we can very nicely extract essential oils, which would in fact be very useful to boost digestion. So these aromatic compounds have carminative properties, meaning that they are very good at breaking down large gas bubbles into smaller gas bubbles so that it's more comfortable for the patient. There's less bloating, less abdominal distension, less borborygmus. Another great carminative is activated charcoal, which is very cheap, easily found in pharmacies, and really helps reduce that bloated feeling and discomfort. Our aromatic plants also tend to have a very nice antiseptic effect. So again, we see the TCM logic being very ahead of its time. A lot of people with stomach yang deficiency, they actually have a stomach acid deficiency, so they're not digesting protein very well. Because they're not digesting protein very well, a lot of only partially digested particles enter the small intestine. Because they haven't been well digested, bacteria starts eating those food remnants. And by eating and being fed, these bacteria now reproduce and produce gases. So the antiseptic effect of these carminative and aromatic plants is also very welcome. And in fact, in order to treat SIBO, we will often use oregano essential oil, mint essential oil to give people relief, fennel essential oil. They've been well researched to really help with that. Again, although all of these plants are in the earth category and are well known in TCM for their digestive effect, remember that many of them can have effects in other spheres. So Melissa, for example, is very useful for people with anxiety, palpitations, difficulty falling asleep. And for many patients, we will not use Melissa at all for its digestive effect, but mostly for its soothing effects on the nervous system and at calming the sympathetic response in the chest area with palpitations and so on. So again, as much as we'd like to put a plant in the neat little category using our reductionist linear thinking, most of these plants have both. If we look at them from a reductionist standpoint, we'll find a great deal of information, but most of them also benefit from the more holistic approach so that we see all of those little different parts coming together to form a whole which is different from the sum of their parts. Our third example has to do with the spleen. So although the spleen is involved in digestion, and a spleen deficiency can create a lot of dampness in the spleen, and therefore dampness in the digestive system with abdominal distension, recurrent yeast infections or yeast in the digestive system, SIBO or bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine. In TCM, the spleen is also the organ, so the yang nature of the spleen is what keeps blood in their vessels, in particular in the venous vessels, venous capillary beds, or the veins themselves. So issues where blood extravasates or comes out of the vessel in TCM always have to do with a spleen yang deficiency. So if a person comes to you with hemorrhoids, bleeding hemorrhoids, varicose veins or varices, capillary fragility like spider veins on their legs or spider veins on their face or rosacea, premenopausal uterine bleeding, or other microcirculatory issues like macular degeneration in the eye would all be related to spleen yang deficiency. Here is also a good time to demonstrate how in the naturopathic practice we need to keep in mind both our holistic way of thinking and our reductionist way of thinking. Because when we're looking at this from a holistic standpoint, uterine bleeding in the premenopausal time can indeed just be a matter of boosting our spleen. But we need to keep a foot in our reductionist and more logical and less intuitive way of thinking, because uterine bleeding between periods could also be due to a large fibroid, a polyp, uterine cancer. And we need to stay aware of that. We can't just prescribe herbs that are spleen yang tonics and not send the patient for a pelvic ultrasound at their gynecologist. So we really need to think in those two different ways in order to provide adequate and excellent and safe care for our patients. Many of the detractors of conventional and alternative practitioners will argue that if a patient comes and sees a naturopath, they are being unsafe because instead of going for their primary care, like getting their gynae checkup and their pelvic ultrasound, here they are coming to see us, taking lots of herbs, and delaying a diagnosis of a potentially serious condition. We really don't want that because there is a shred of truth in that. We want to be perceived as practitioners who can work safely, who are able to refer out to conventional practitioners to rule out any serious cause of illness that needs a prompt diagnosis and sometimes prompt conventional treatments. It doesn't exclude doing natural therapies alongside of them. It doesn't exclude, for example, getting surgery done, getting radiation done, and then coming back to the naturopathic practice to do prevention or to help alleviate side effects of the medication they might be put on. So we really need to keep these two parallel ways of thinking together, and hopefully in the naturopathic practice it is a place where the pendulum comes back in the middle. It's a balanced way of practicing. So if we identify a spleen-yang deficiency in our patient with any of the above, then we think of spleen-yang tonics. So again, in TCM, they call them spleen-yang tonics, but we see that many of these herbs are indeed great for the venous walls because they contain tannins, which strengthen, tonify that capillary wall. Cypress, of course, is a good one. Blueberry and horse chestnuts are other examples. Blueberry is also particularly good for the microcirculation in much smaller capillary beds and particularly in the eye. So blueberry, cranberry, other types of berries are now also well known for their lutein content, and we use them a lot to try and prevent or reverse early onset macular degeneration in the eye. Horse chestnut is very well used topically on hemorrhoids, on spider veins as well. And if we see spleen-yang deficiency, which will manifest as uterine bleeding or spotting, then we can use other herbs like yarrow, for example, which works very well on these types of uterine complaints with spotting and bleeding. When a person has spleen-yang deficiency, they may just have these extravasation symptoms, or they can also feel bloated, that spleen dampness picture, the abdomen distended. Generally, the stools are watery, loose, frequent yeast infections, feeling lethargic. And in that case, geranium, which is also very high in tannin content, can be very good to dry up the stool and make it more formed. Raspberry leaf tea or blueberry tea or basically any berry tea is also very good to dry up diarrhea, extremely safe also in young children and pregnant women. So again, we see that some of these plants have more of an effect on the capillary side of the spleen-yang tonifying effect, and others can be great for the digestive side of a spleen-yang deficiency, and we need to know which herbs are for which sphere. So we can use either a herb that would be in the earth element, in the digestive element, or a herb that would help more for the capillary beds. Again, we see that plants are very versatile and they don't fit in one nice linear category, and we need to be aware of the various categories in which they work. Another great herb for drying up menstrual blood in case of heavy periods or spotting is of course Capsella bursa pastoris or shepherd's purse, which is again very, very safe, high in tannins. Another plant that has a high tannin content is green tea or black tea, Camellia sinensis. This can be very useful to apply as poultices on top of boils or pustules. That is because when there is pus underneath the skin in a pustule or a boil, when we apply the tannins over top of it, the skin fibers will tighten up. And as they do that, it will put pressure on the pustule for the pus to eventually erupt and for that pustule or boil to start draining. So we will often use them to draw something out of a pustule. Very safe, very useful, particularly useful if it is a hot poultice. So for example, on top of a sty on the eye, you could boil a strong green or black tea, Let it steep for about 10 minutes, covered. Dip a cotton ball in it. Wait for it to cool down to a bearable amount of heat and apply it to the sty. When it starts to cool down, dip it again in the hot tea. Wait for it to cool a little bit. Apply it as hot as possible to the sty to help it drain faster and avoid needing oral antibiotics to treat it. Again, here are a few pictures so that we remember what we're talking about. In the bottom left corner, of course, this is our cypress. So the little balls or nuts found on the cypress tree is what we use for its tannin astringent effect. It is often planted in cemeteries, and the homeopathic usage of this plant often has to do with superstition and fear of death, interestingly enough. In the middle here, the purple plant is Geranium maculatum, or a plant that, as I said earlier, is very useful as an astringent for the digestive system when there's a lot of watery, loose stools, especially useful in the case of IBS or bacterial infections of the gut. The picture on the top right, that is the horse chestnut tree. So again, the nuts is what is used in order to help with hemorrhoids, varices, and spider veins. It can be used orally for long periods of time, very, very safely. And now we've come to our summary slide, which is gradually the end of this presentation. So we've seen how phytoenergetics, or classifying plants according to their energetics, is very useful so that we may choose the right medicinal plant that matches the clinical symptoms of the patients. In other words, that matches the energetics or holistic diagnosis of the person. So if it's a spleen yang deficiency, we'll need a spleen yang tonic. If it's a lung yin deficiency, we'll need a lung yin tonic. Although plants can be studied from a reductionist perspective, and it's indeed very useful, we cannot only classify them in such a linear fashion. It is the energetics of the plant, or the more holistic perspective of the plant, that allows us to use the most adequate plant for the patient's holistic diagnosis. This is also where the 5 elements fit in. So do we need a plant in the metal, earth, fire? That question can be answered when we look at the patient's diagnosis. Traditional Chinese medicine uses its own terminology, so based on the 8 principles and based on the 5 elements, to categorize plants according to their actions and energetic properties. And this terminology can sometimes be a little intimidating to the student. The 5 elements, the 8 principles. It may take a while to grasp those, but remember that it's just a terminology. It's just a way that the TCM practitioners of the time found to describe, to try and be a little more reductionistic, to understand the parts better of a system that they were perceiving mostly holistically. So hopefully this presentation has given you a bit of an appreciation for the way we can think reductionistly and holistically, how that works in the naturopathic practice, how it's important to understand the holistic perspective, especially when thinking in terms of TCM, to understand the plants from a reductionist and a holistic standpoint, so that ultimately we can pick the best plant for a patient based on their TCM diagnosis. So we've now gradually come to the end of this presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it and wishing you a great rest of the day.